journey. Okay, since the recording just started, I'm going to repeat myself. I hope that's okay with all of you. uh, Welcome to our 5th edition of A Coach's Journey. This is a series that's very, very close to my heart. And today's conversation in particular is something that I've been eagerly waiting forward to because we're diving into a topic that is both profound and essential for any coach on the path to growth: the difference between mastery and masterfulness. To help us explore this nuanced distinction, I'm honored to host Rachel Goger, Guiding Light's newly credentialed MCC coach, whose journey is nothing short of inspiring. Rachel is someone who does not simply accumulate knowledge. She embodies it. She won't speak on a subject unless she's truly convinced of its depth and meaning. She's not in a rush to claim certainty, but instead moves with quiet confidence, embracing the unknown as an essential part of wisdom. Her journey has been one of depth, transformation, and an intentional shift from perfectionism to masterfulness. A recovering perfectionist, in her own words, Rachel has willingly shed the need for flawlessness in pursuit of something far more powerful, a way of being that is fluid, intuitive, and deeply present. Beyond coaching, Rachel is a person of many layers. She finds joy in reading, history, art, traveling, cooking, gardening, and organizing. These aren't just hobbies for Rachel, they reflect her innate curiosity, her appreciation for structure and creativity, and her deep connection to the world around her. Today, Rachel and I will explore: what does mastery mean, and how does it differ from masterfulness? How does being comfortable with not knowing shape a coach's presence? And what does it take to evolve from skillful coaching to coaching with depth and ease? But before we begin with mastery and masterfulness, Rachel will tell us her coaching and credentialing story, and then we'll begin. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Madhu. So we were just talking about how I ended up being a coach, and just before we got on this call, we had another very similar conversation happening. So I never started out to be a coach, but I think that's true for many coaches. For a lot of us, this is a second career. But for me, I think I kind of just stumbled upon it. So I think there are some parts to me being a coach that were always true. And when I look back in hindsight, I think this very closely ties to my purpose in life. So I started out like a lot of people in India as an engineer. I worked in technology for 14 years. I loved working in technology, and I like to say this many times, right? So when I was in engineering and my early days of technology work, engineering work, I used to always say, "Oh, I love technology. I'm always going to be an engineer." And unlike most people in India who were at that time working in software, I was working in hardware, right? So I used to work with servers and storage and networking and all of that. And I used to love that work. I used to always say, "Oh, I love technology. I'm going to always was the keyword here." And then at some point, I started growing in the organizations that I was in. I became a manager, and I realized, oh, I love managing teams and I love managing business. And I'm like, I'm always going to be a leader, right? And then, and then one fine day, I found coaching, or rather, coaching found me, and that's also an interesting story because I think I've always been a learner. I love learning, and one of my very early decisions was that I'll always invest a percentage of my income into my own learning. So even as an engineer, I would every year, kind of work towards one new training or certification or something. So whenever I used to get a bonus, I would always invest my bonus into self-development, a practice that I incidentally have continued till today. So coaching was something so I was working in this organization called HP, Hewlett Packard. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the name. And HP Europe had acquired a company, HP had acquired a company called EDS. And the European part of EDS had this philosophy that if the moment somebody became a manager, they had to compulsorily go through ACC level training. Certification was not mandatory, but a lot of the managers had also got certified. And this I'm talking like 2010, 11, right? It's very, very, a good 15 years back. And I found this whole, on the intranet, I found this whole group of people who were talking about this thing called coaching. And because I was in India, my understanding of coaching was only coaching centers or tuition centers, right? And like, what is this, right? And I just happened to attend one of their calls. And I was like, oh, and I was very, very intrigued by it. And then I'm like, okay, maybe next year when I'm like looking to get trained, I can add this as a skill, because I could see it as being something I could, use in my managing my team and stuff. And that's when I figured out nobody trains in India. Okay, so, but the good part was we had a Hyderabad chapter back then. And I think Delhi was also there. I'm not sure, but Hyderabad was there. And I went on to the ICF website and I found the contact number of the president of the then Hyderabad chapter. And I reached out to him and he told me that, yeah, this is a great thing, but you first have to, and I still remember his words. See, so coaching is a profession, but in this profession, more than becoming a coach, you have to be a coach. Right. And honestly, it didn't really make sense for me back then. And he guided me in, so I got certified and I got trained through this company called Coach You Australia. They used to do a batch, and this is like pre-Zoom and all of that. So everything used to happen in person, right? And once a year, they would do coach training in India in any one city. And I think the universe wanted me to be a coach. So that year, they were having that training in Bangalore. And just like a couple of months ahead of when I started searching. So I was lucky. I joined in. I got trained. Again, I had no intention of making it a career. It was just another skill I was adding because I just like to learn. And those 8 days of in-person, so the entire training was 8 days in person, nothing online back then. And everything was over email. And those 8 days changed me as a person, because I suddenly felt that, yes, this is what I have been looking for. This is who I really am. Yeah. But again, I still had no intention of making this a career. I started, I thought I'll take it back to my team. One thing I was very lucky with was that HP Europe used to have these programs there. They were very, very keen on coaching back then. And they used to have these programs. And if you're a certified coach, you could coach any senior leader long as they're not part of the same business unit. So 2012, so I got my training sometime in 2011, and till 2012, I accumulated my 100 hours for ACC. Now, I did not again realize it then, but I was lucky because I was actually trained, coaching senior leaders right from day one. And I think the other thing that happened, really good happened for me, was because there were hardly any coaches around. There was no concept of peer coaching. It was one of those very rare things that people used to do. So my entire 100 hours were actually coaching client hours. Right. And that's something that I realized had a lot of value. So 2012, I got my ACC. And then I said, okay, but I still had no intention of making it a career. I continued to work in my corporate job. And then I thought, okay, now since I'm continuing to coach, let me start also thinking, do I want to at some point do a PCC, right? And of course, PCC needed a lot more hours. And so, and that's when I started thinking, sorry.
Rachel, pause. No worries.
Thank you. So that's when I started thinking that maybe this is something I like to do when I retire. Okay, so again, no intention of making this a career. And around that time, I also started, getting interested in NLP. So I trained to be an NLP practitioner, and then I went for my PCC training. By that time, there were 2 institutes in India that had started training. Okay, so we're talking like 2014, 15. So I went for my PCC training and I went for my NLP master practitioner. And right in the middle of one of the exercises that I was doing in my NLP practitioner, I had this moment that just told me very clearly, this is what I want to do now. I don't want to wait till retirement. And that's how I finished that training, went back to my manager and said, I'm quitting. Right. So it was just that, no, long planning. And of course, then the reality hit, oh, I've got, loans and I've got this EMI to pay and all of that. But I think, once you make a decision, then you figure out a way to make it work. So, so I was paying an EMI for a property and I'm like, do I really need this? So I just sold it. I actually sold it. I'm like, I don't want all of this, right? I don't need so much stuff in my life. So I let go of a lot of things, sold a lot of stuff, became absolutely, whatever, loan free. And I said that, okay, I'm going to make this work. But also, there was this whole thing of what if I can't, because I'd always been in a job, I'd never run a business. And my mom, I remember telling me, we are not the business type of people, and you have to be very crooked when you run a business and you don't understand nuances of it. And, so my mom was, and then there was this whole thing of my people telling me, you have got such a good job and you've got this whole status that comes with being in the corporate job. And when you say I'm a manager in HP, people may not know what you're doing, but they think you're a big deal and all of that, right? And, and I also had a little bit of identity crisis, because when you introduce yourself as manager in HP versus I'm Rachel Goger and I'm a coach, back then, nobody, even half the people didn't know what a coach was, right? My parents didn't know what I did, right? So it was quite one of those things that, I just had to trust that this was right. In the face of everybody saying that, and I remember my manager, when I said, I want to quit and I want to do this, I remember my manager saying, you're due for your next promotion. Right? Wait for the next 3 months. Next month, your promotion comes. Uske baad, in a couple months, your salary gets increased. So I'm like, see, even if that happens, how is that helping me? Right? Because it's not that I'm going for another job so that I'll take that and, ask for a higher salary. I'm not going to be sitting here to draw that salary, and I don't want to, because right now I'm just feeling right now's the time, and I don't want to sit on it because I don't want to lose that, momentum that I have right now. And I promised myself one thing, that I said, I'm going to give myself 2 years. And in 2 years, if I don't make it, I'm going to go back to a corporate job. Okay. And this is 2014. Now it's 11 years. I haven't gone back. So yeah, I've been very, very happy with what I've done. Never felt any regret. I've been, I think, also a little bit of a maverick in my journey, right? Because when I quit my corporate job, I was 33 or 34, and back then, anybody and everybody in the coaching industry was typically doing it as a post-retirement career. And, in my competition at that point, of course, half of the market didn't know what, most of the market didn't know what coaching is. And there were a lot of senior HR folks or retired CEOs masquerading as coaches, because the client didn't know what a coach was supposed to do, right? So they would do everything from training to mentoring and call it coaching. And I did have those moments of self-doubt, that why would somebody hire me over? But then, and I remember so many people in the coaching fraternity telling me, you're too young. You're too young to do this, right? You haven't seen life yet. You haven't seen the world yet, and but I don't know. I mean, sometimes yeah, I find it very funny, but I just had this very deep belief that this is what I have to do. The other thing was also, a lot of people told me things like, you're not going to be able to just survive on a coaching income, right? People told me they have to, most of the coaches need to either be trainers or facilitators or do consulting on the side and all of that. And I was like, no, because one, I don't enjoy training, to be honest, right? It's not something that I have a lot of love for. It's also not a skill, right? And I'm like, there's a very clear reason why I'm quitting my corporate job, and that is to get into coaching. So I am not going to do anything else, and I'm going to build a successful business out of coaching. And again, I think I am one of those people who kind of bulldoze my way into, when I've decided, and I just bulldoze and make it happen types. So I have been throughout these 11 years only coaching, right? I've also, of course, get to hear stuff like, oh, you're a woman, so maybe you don't need to worry about the income and all of that. That's not true. I'm extremely ambitious. I'm very, very business-minded. And I earn more today in my coaching business than I did in my corporate job. So that's something I'm very proud of. And I want to say that it's something that's completely doable. There's enough work in the market, right? So I would say that if you like training, if you like consulting, if you like all of that, do it. Good for you, right? But don't do it because you feel that coaching is not going to give you a good income. It is completely, and I still feel that there is so much out there. I mean, I sometimes say no to projects because I don't want to do them, or they don't align with my value system, or sometimes when I don't have bandwidth also. But I feel that there is enough work. There are not enough people. So, that's my experience. And again, like I said, I just decide on something and then I make it happen. So that's been me. And what else about the journey? I think, yeah. So along the way, so I started out as a one-on-one coach, like most coaches. And then one fine day, there was this client who came to me and said, we've got this group of people, and do you do group work? I said, no, I don't train. So he said, no, the same thing that you did with me, can you do that in a group? So I'm like, there is something called group coaching. I've never done it. But I said, give me a couple of months. I want to just figure it out. So I bought a few books, and I spent a lot of time reading and studying and watching videos and stuff. And I said, okay, I think I know coaching enough to experiment with this. And I did it for a very, very reasonable cost back then, because that was the first time. And I realized, oh, I loved doing this. I enjoyed the impact I created. It was a very, very impactful thing. And then I said, okay, now this is another offering I can go for. Somewhere in 2019. So this whole MCC thing actually, one of the other things that I've always held myself to as a standard is, like I said, because I didn't start in an environment where peer coaching was an option. All my coaching hours typically have been, so in 2019, I had completed my 2000, I was close to that 2,500. And those entire 2,500 hours were client hours. Not even a single one of them was peer coaching hours. And honestly, there was times in between that I'd been part of programs where we were peer coaching, and I didn't even know I could add them as coaching hours. So the part of that was also ignorance. But I think the fact that I coach so many real clients really added through, because coaching another coach is very different from coaching a client. And that's a fact, right? Because you will never have those level of challenges with the variety of people that you meet. Coaches are very easy to coach. Clients are not always, right? So I think that's another thing that I've always stood for. I did do, of course, when I was doing my MCC prep, that's when I realized, oh, so many people do so much peer coaching, right? And then I did a lot of peer coaching then, but none of the hours that I used for MCC were necessarily that. So I was telling the story of my 2019, right? So that's when I was ready for my MCC. I was thinking about, okay, now it's time to apply. And because 2020, my PCC was coming up for renewal. So I said, I'll apply for that. But at the same time, I got introduced to team coaching as a concept. So initially I was arrogant enough to think I can do both. But then I figured out, oh, no, this is too much to take on together. So I said, okay, I'm going to park MCC on the side and go for team coaching. So I got certified in team coaching. I was again one of the first team coaches in India. And my initial certification was from EMCC, because in India, ICF back then did not have a team coaching certification. So I got certified as a team coach in 2020. I've been coaching teams also since then. And of course, once ICTC was launched by ICF, I got certified by them as well. And yeah, and then 2023, I said, okay, now enough. I've done a lot of other stuff. Now it's time to maybe go back to MCC. And that's when I came back to the MCC thing. And then last 1.5 years have been about that. And now here I am. It's a long story. Sorry if I've just been rambling on.
When I said, it was an inspiring story, I think it was an understatement. What really stood out in this entire journey, Rachel, is the fact that you said you were a maverick, and how coaching found you and how you were not afraid. But what I'd like to ask is, what made you believe that this was meant for you?
I think there was a very, so one part of it is I enjoyed it. So, but, like I told you, I was handling teams before that. And I think there's a little bit of history there as well, because see, like I said, I come from a family that, so I come from a very lower middle class kind of a family, and my parents had worked really hard to kind of educate me and all of that, right? But I was also one of the first people in my family to work in a corporate job, right? So, and honestly, when you're new to the corporate world, it takes you a while to really figure it out, right? But one thing that I have always been, and I think I largely owe that to my parents, is that they did teach me the value of hard work. So I've always been that, put your head down and work really hard people. So because of that, I would always be good at the work that I would do, right? I was a good student. I was a good engineer. I was a good employee as such, right? So I think I did, kind of gain a lot because of that. So I was able to survive in, the corporate world. I figured stuff out. I kind of learned stuff. But one of the things that I did realize was that in the early days, I did not have a mentor. I did not have anybody to guide me, right? So my thought was the day I become a team manager, I will always guide my team in their careers and in their growth and in their development. So I was one of those people who would very diligently have growth plans, goal setting, and because I really believed in, and I'm I've set targets for myself that my team should have the highest number of promotions, and because I really wanted people to grow, and it felt very personal to me. So when coaching happened, and I used to believe back then, because I didn't know what coaching was, that I'm coaching my team. So, and coaching and mentoring is the same thing, right? So I remember, when I went for the whole first coach training that I went for, to me, it felt like, this is what it's about. This is about unlocking, because this is about really helping people come into their own, right? And of course, as part of the training, when we practice with each other, and the number of things that would come up for me, and we were practicing first time ACC training, so nobody's come with any, learning of coaching. And I remember just feeling the amount of my own potential in those, very basic early coaching conversations that was getting. And then, of course, we had a couple of people who were MCCs. Then, our trainer was an MCC, and she'd come all the way from Australia. And she, when she was doing the demos, right, I was just in awe of how much she unlocked. And for me, the thought was, oh, if I can do this for my team, right? So that was the early thought. Now, when I connect the dots in hindsight, I also realized I was one of those people who was doing it for my classmates in college. I was doing it for my classmates in school. I remember one of the times my roommate in engineering, she was saying something to the effect like, something she was not feeling like studying and all that. I don't clearly remember what I said, but I said something to her. And she turned to me and said, how do you always know what to say that makes me want to get up and go and study? Right. And I'm like, I just said what came to my mind, right? So I think somewhere and I think this is something that has been my innate purpose. And, when I finally did some work with Simon Sinek and all of that, his purpose work and all of that, I think the big thing that came out for me is my purpose is to help people really come into their own, right? So when and I think I'm deviating a little from your question, but to your point of how did I know that this was right? It felt very viscerally right. Deep within me, it was, and that's why I also say now that, before that I was saying, oh, I'll do this someday, I'll do it after my retirement, all of that, and I was also giving myself these excuses, oh, I have, EMIs to pay, oh, I have this to save for, oh, I have to take care of this, I have to take care of that. I had all those list of things, right? And I had a young child. I'm like, oh, I can't look at, shifting now because it'll upset the whole thing. But the moment I decided, and the moment I'm going to make this happen, solutions for everything came around. Yeah. So I think that, and sometimes we have our clients also say this in coaching session, there's an inner knowing. So it's just there. And I did not have, and I think that's how we humans do most of our decision making, right? We make the decision and then we find logic to justify it. So I think it was just one of those things that was meant to be, I think, for me. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Rachel. Shall we get on to the questions now?
Absolutely.
Okay. So personally, how do you define mastery in coaching, and how does it differ from masterfulness?
So this is something that, mastery in coaching, right? So like I said, I've always been brought up to be very hardworking. I am a hard worker. I am very, very grit is my thing, you know, consistency is my superpower, I'm that person. So, you know, and because I think our education system also says stuff like, you know, coming first, aiming, like I would be that kid who would aim for the highest marks and stuff like that, right? So I think somewhere in my mind, I used to believe that mastery is that thing where you become supreme. There's nobody better than you, right? But my learning in the last 1 year of my MCC journey has been that mastery is unattainable. Okay, so and Marcia Reynolds say this. There's this quite a bit, and I think that's where I heard it the first time. And she said something to the effect that it's a path of mastery. It's not a path to mastery. So you continue to walk the path, but it's an unending path. You never arrive. Right? So mastery is an unending journey. It's not a destination. Masterfulness, on the other hand, for me, masterfulness is an embodiment of what you know. Right? And the way I have experienced this, and this does not necessarily have to be just with coaching, right? Even if we take any skill, I mean, take your skill of driving, right? So masterfulness, I think, has an aspect of skill to it, but there is a skill that is become unconsciously embodied within you, where you're not consciously reminding yourself. Like when you learn to drive, your first day, you're trying to remember which is the accelerator and which is the clutch and which is the brake and where do you put the first gear and all of that, right? And for the first few days, every time you're putting the gear, you have to remind yourself to press the clutch. I don't know if anybody, if this is making sense, because I still drive a stick. I know a lot of people now drive automatic. So yeah, so to a large extent, mastery is about getting to that place where there is skill, but the skill is so embodied. Like now when I drive, I'm not even thinking. I'm just you know, so I think it's where it's so embodied in you that you don't have to think about it. So that's one part of it. But I also feel masterfulness comes in stages. And I think coaching, like they say, coaching is a practice, right? And practice makes perfect, but I don't think it makes perfect. It's because it's unending. But the more you do, the better you get, provided you do it, you're intentional about where you're getting. So I think masterfulness is just stages and stages. So like if I say driving a car in a inside road versus driving on a highway, two different things. Driving on a rough terrain, another thing completely. Driving on a very, very busy highway, again, completely different thing, right? So it comes in stages, and I think masterfulness is about upping the level of complexity that you can handle with ease without having to consciously work at it. And it's an embodied sense. So you don't have to remind yourself. Masterfulness comes when you don't have to remind yourself. It's just flowing through you. I don't know that. That's how
Beautiful.
I experience it.
Yeah, I love how you said it comes in stages and then it's an embodiment and you don't have to put your mind to it. It just flows through you. Lovely. So where do you think it emerges from? Where do you think this not knowing just emerges? Where is that emergence coming from?
I think, so I think it emerges. So it's been a very interesting thing for me, right? The whole journey of not just MCC, but my entire coaching journey. I think the more I know, the less I feel the need. So maybe a better way to put it is like when I was in my early stages of ACC, I was very by the structure, right? And there were a lot of tools, and I was always trying to read and find out what tool can I use. Today, if my coaching is purely conversational, I rarely, if ever, need to use any activity, any technique, it's purely words, it's purely conversation, largely silence, and mostly based on presence. So where does it emerge from? I think for me, the big shift of where it's emerging from is not, there is also this sense of being one with a higher source, right? So when you say it emerges, I think it's more of it flows through me rather than it. So it's a higher consciousness that flows through me. It's not necessarily coming from my intelligence, so so it does emerges from a higher power is what I would call it.
Yeah. Love it. Goes back to how the flow experience happens.
Yeah.
So what shifts in mindset are required to move from technical competence to masterfulness? I mean, it's a follow on to what you already said, but yeah, if there's a nuance there.
Yeah. So I think the first thing that we cannot discount is the technical knowledge of any work that you're doing. I mean, not necessarily coaching. So skill is not so it's not, negotiable to work on your skill. You need to work on your skill, right? So there is a learning, training aspect that is extremely critical, right? It's like, the way to look at it is, if you want to be a poet, you better know your ABC, right? So your skill, your training, your knowledge is your ABC, right? The poetry that flows from you is where the actual, so there's part of you that's flowing, there's part of your creativity that's flowing, there's part of a bigger power that's at play. But having skill is so, and again, because as I said earlier, coaching is a practice. So you need to practice your skill. So that is step one. That is, it's not something that you can do away with. The risk in our profession in coaching is that a lot of us work alone. We don't necessarily have a boss watching over us or a quality person doing audits on our calls and stuff like that, right? So it's very easy to not follow that. But if you look at, and I'll take some, comparisons with the sportsmen, right? Some of the, or even, I mean, look at it, I'm sure there are people in this room who work out, right? So just because you've been working out for a long time does not mean you stop doing warm-ups and cool downs. Right? So those basics still need to be in place, right? Now, having said that, once your technical competence is in place, so it's again, I'm going to go back to driving the car. You still need to know what an accelerator is. You still need to know what your gear is, right? But once you have that basic competence, it's about going much, much deeper, right? It's about working on yourself. So coaching, to really move forward in coaching, there is the skill, there is working on yourself, because whoever you are is what you will coach from. So everything that you are, your fears, your biases, your any complexities within you, they will all show up into the coaching session, right? So you coach from who you are. So the more self-aware and deep work that you do on yourself, that's another big one, right? And the third is to develop trust in the process, trust in your knowing, trust in the higher power that's allowing your work to happen, and being completely present with the client. Yeah. So this is the shift that needs to happen. Technical knowledge is just step one, but it's a non-negotiable step one.
Yeah, it is. That's true. So how does one recognize when they're trying too hard when they're coaching?
So very early, and this is my first trainer, for my first ACC trainer, she had said, if it feels like work, then it's not coaching. Right? In coaching, the client does all the work. If it feels like you are having to put in effort, that means you're not coaching. So if you're trying as such, if it's effort that's coming from you, and it's either you're not coaching or you're doing something that's you think is coaching, but it's not really coaching. So that's where trying too hard comes in. Versus real coaching is all flow. It's effortless, right? I also experience it, and again, I can't speak for everybody, but my experience of when it's a really deep coaching session is I am not very, so the time expands. There's a sense of time expanding, space expanding. There's been a deep connection. There is also a sense of, for me, there's also the sense of being present, but not so much present to myself, but present to what is. You know, I feel a sharpening in my senses. I will intuitively, and I think that's also one of my learnings that, of masterfulness, is that your intuition picks up the right thing. Yeah. So that to me is where, it's flowing on its own. If I'm having to put in effort, then then it's largely that, then I know, then it's very uncomfortable. And I think your body always tells you, right? When you're trying, there is that feeling of, oh, I want to make something happen and it's not working, right? So I think your body always tells you when something's out of whack. I think the other thing that I would also say, there's this saying that I think this is part of the, the one of the Tao verses that says that you sometimes, it's always allowing over trying. So coaching is a lot about allowing. It's not necessarily about trying. It's like, what can you do? Like, if you have to grow a plant, you can dig up the soil, plant the seed, water it, and then you have to just allow it, right? So coaching, you get together, you create the space, you create the atmosphere, you show up with full presence, you listen to what the person is saying, and then what has to emerge will emerge. Yeah.
That's good. And how has your relationship with not knowing evolved as you grew as a coach?
So that's very, again, I'm going to go back to this fact of our education system always telling us that you need to know. If you're going in for a meeting, you need to be prepared. If you're, all of those things that, I remember when I was in my corporate role, that if you have to go meet a client, you'd read up all their financial reports for 3 years back, you'll go through their website and, get really clear on what products they work with and, how all of that, right? So knowledge is power. We've all heard that as well, right? I think as I've worked in coaching, I've realized that's not always true. There's a lot of power in not knowing. In fact, not knowing makes you more powerful, because then that's when you know the right questions. The right questions emerge from the not knowing, not from the knowing. Knowing actually gets in the way. Because when you don't know, you are also, knowing kind of makes you judgmental, because then you're measuring a person against what you know. Versus if you're sitting in the unknowing or not knowing space, you're willing to give people benefit of doubt, you have more empathy, you have more curiosity. And I think not knowing also allows me to be in a beginner's mindset. Right? No, as a coach, I'm sure a lot of people in this room have also experienced it. 2 clients will come up with the exact same presenting problem, but they'll walk out with completely different things. So if you get into a session and say, oh, I handled this had the same discussion with another client, and that's the same thing here, that's going to get in the way, because then you're not present to what's showing up, right? So I think not knowing is where I feel my power comes from now. I also, incidentally, now if I'm making, because I do corporate work as well. So when I'm meeting a corporate client also, I don't read up their website. I don't, the maximum I'll know is, where are they based? And that's pretty much it. Will be half the time I may not look at it. Even there, I go in with the not knowing. So
Just you sharing that makes me feel so liberated. You don't have to know anything.
Yeah. I think a lot of problem, in fact, in the workspace, I think a lot of problems that I see is people not knowing or pretending that they know. Right? Not being comfortable. But I really believe that not knowing in itself is a superpower.
Yeah. Awesome. And what is the role of surrender in masterfulness?
Oh, it's all surrender. So I think one of the things that, when we talk about surrender, right? So it's very close to the not knowing, right? Not knowing means you're okay to say, I don't know this. And you're okay with whatever reaction emerges from the other side, right? Most of the time, your client's not going to hold it against you, but you might have somebody who might hold it against you. And it's about being okay with that, right? Because it's about being authentic. It's about being true, right? And like I said, a lot of problems in the world, especially the corporate space today, come from the fact that people are scared of not knowing, or they are pretending that they know, right? A lot of times I've had, clients who like preparing for an interview and they'll say, oh, how do I, if I ask them a question like, when you walk out of the room, what impression would you like to leave there? And they'll say, oh, they should feel I know everything. So I'm like, okay, that's a little hard to achieve because we have no clue what they're going to ask you, right? So I think it's about true confidence also comes from the not knowing. So I think surrender to me is about trusting in the work that I've done over the years, trusting that what has to emerge will emerge, and trusting if something doesn't work out, that's also okay. That's also part of the growth. Right? And it's and like you mentioned, and I told you earlier, right? Like I'm a recovering perfectionist. I've also made peace with the fact that there is no such thing as perfection. It's always a journey. So yeah.
Love it. I love how you said that knowing is what comes in the way, and not knowing is fantastic. I think you're bursting a lot of myths, Rachel. I mean, when we take questions, I hope somebody comes up with how many things they kind of thought was a certain way, and they're leaving with a new perspective. Yeah, I think the next question is about perfectionism itself. I think we kind of handled that, but how has it kind of shown up in your journey, and in what ways did you see it limiting you as a coach, being a perfectionist?
So I think I won't say that it was completely limiting. I think to a large extent, it was also what allowed me to set very high standards for my own learning, right? So I've always been, because I've always chased high standards in the work that I do. And like I said, the thing with our work is, and applies to me as well, I work alone, right? So I don't have a boss who's checking my calls. I don't always have somebody else telling me, oh, you did well or did not do well. But because I've always wanted to be good at what I do, and perfection has been something that I've, wanted to achieve. So from my very early days, I remember that when I had just started coaching, one of the things I used to do was after every call, I would sit and grade my own call on the ICF competencies, right? So I used to do that. I still have a very strong pre and post process for my calls, right? So before the call, I have a process to get ready for the call. And after the call or the session, I have a reflection thing just to kind of check in with how did I do? Was there something I could have done differently? One of the other things that I used to do very, very diligently in my early years was every month, I would take one of the competencies and focus deeply. I would read up about it. I would concentrate on my calls on that specific. So I do believe that a need for perfection does push you to really work on your craft. At the same time, I think it also becomes limiting because sometimes you get too hard on yourself. And I think when I started my MCC journey, that's what started to get in the way. Right now, for those of you who are on the the ICF credential path, you'll know that at different. So I think now they've changed the ACC exam, but the exam till now it was the same for everybody. Also, your grading, the markers are very similar. They're not exactly the same, but it's like the higher you go in the certification rank, the expectation is that you get that many things like right. And because I come from that whole mindset of, and like I said, I was one of those very good students, very diligent students. So I wanted to be this person who submitted the perfect call. And there's no such thing. Right. So I kept coming up with calls and I kept beating myself, oh, I missed this, oh, I missed that, oh, I didn't do this right, and at some point I got supremely frustrated because I was not getting my perfect call, right? And that was around the time that, I started working with Shri, and we had this conversation that, I get so he gave me some pointers on one of the calls. And after that, for a long time, wouldn't send him a call. And he kept messaging me, when are you sending your next call? When are you sending your next call? And I'm like, I'm not finding that perfect call. So I told him that when I send it to you, I want that to be the perfect call, right? I'd even put myself on this, that I want to only submit my application, that it has to go in the first time. If it doesn't clear the first time, I don't, I just want to be that person that it goes in, it clears, and that's it, right? So I think perfection started getting in the way because I started putting too much pressure on myself. right? And to that extent that I started thinking, oh, is this a goal I cannot achieve? And that was something that, again, I was making me like very, very upset with myself. And I remember Shrikant having this conversation with me about this. And he said, that's where we had this conversation that mastery is an unending thing. And one of the things he did for me, and I'm really grateful for that, is he made me listen to one of his early calls when he had just become an MCC. And of course, we've all listened to some of his demos on that he does now. So he said, just listen to this call. He didn't tell me it's his call. Okay. And somehow I didn't recognize the voice also. And I listened to it. And he said, this call is something that will clear an MCC. So I'm like, this call will clear an MCC. Right. And he's like, yeah, this is my call from 4 years back. So he said, see, you've heard my present calls. So even I've moved on. Right. And it's an unending path. So your journey to mastery is not going to stop. Right now, you're aiming for certifications. So I think, that was one of the places where I felt that, my need for perfection started to really get in the way. But I would also say that after that conversation, and of course, me and Shri did he was my mentor for my entire MCC path. So one of the biggest changes that I've come with is this: perfection is good to aim for, but it's having that knowledge of what's a high standard you're setting for yourself and where do you draw the line where it comes to, and also this thing of sometimes, like I still, do a reflection after every call and I'll point out, oh, this was a word that I missed exploring, but I've now made peace with, even if I missed exploring a word, whatever the client's taken away is adding value to them. So, yeah, so I think perfection serves you, but then there are times that it doesn't.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you one last question, Rachel, and then we'll open it up, although I have more, but I think we're running short of time. So if you had to unlearn one thing today to step further into masterfulness, what would that be?
Unlearn, if I say, I think that has been something that I need to continue to do, and that is that need to feel that I know everything. Right. So while I say that not knowing is the superpower, I still sometimes get caught into that trap of, oh, I need to learn more, or I need to. Also, part of it is I enjoy learning, so that's always a motivation. But I also have something that I have to keep reminding myself is that learning is an unending journey, mastery is an unending journey, but I'm quite okay with where I am also. This is also a good place to be, Yeah.
Yeah, all of us aspire to be in the place that you are, so it's a great place to be.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's open it up. Anybody has questions to ask, uh, turn your cameras on, please, and we'll get into an active dialogue with Rachel. Yes, Ranjit, go ahead.
Hi, Rachel. Hi, Madhu. Thanks for this wonderful call. Uh, I had this question, Rachel, to you. Obviously, you evolved from ACC to MCC, and the way I see it is you came closer to the source more. You're operating from the source more, from that intuition space of intuition. So I wanted to check with you is when someone is already aligned to the source, when someone is operating in complete surrenderness to the source, and it's completely allowing what is going through them to go as it is and presenting it to the client in the way we normally engage, correct? So if someone is in that space, because since you have experienced it, I wanted to know, like, what is the value of skills? That is the first question. Because why I'm asking this question is because once you have surrendered to the source, you will know what are the skills that are required for you to step into situation or step into conversations. Correct. So you will naturally work on that skills because it's guiding. Because normally what happens, we go the other way around. We develop skills and then come to a space wherein we are completely surrendered, correct? So my question is, when someone is in that space, what is the value of skills for someone at that space, and what would you be your guidance or your advice for someone who is operating from that space as a coach?
So, so the thing that I would say, and again, this is purely my opinion. So when we talk about the source is infinite. Yeah. Also, the source is not one thing. Yeah. So to me, the way I would look at it is, if you're a spiritual leader, there's a high possibility you are also connected to the source, right? Maybe you're just somebody who has a very deep meditation practice, and you might also feel the connection to the source. I know a lot of artists. I'm an artist myself, and one of the things that I say is when I paint, I do feel a connection to the source, right? So the way I would look at it is the source is infinite. The source is capable of giving us so much, right? The value of skill here is, what do you do with it? Right. So to me, developing skill now, like I said, I feel the source when I'm painting. I sometimes feel the source when I'm writing. I even feel the source when I'm doing my gardening. I know of people who talk about feeling the source when they are, in nature. So the source is infinite and it can give you a lot. I think skill is, what are you going to do and how are you going to channel that? So the skill allows you to channel this source is, again, this is a way I experience it. Yeah. Did I answer your question, Ranjit?
Yeah. I think you answered it beautifully. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Rachel.
Vineet put a question in the chat. Vineet, do you want to ask that question yourself? Would you like to turn your camera on and ask? Otherwise,
Hi,
there you
Rachel.
go. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, Vineet.
Hi. So good to see you, Rachel.
Likewise.
So I just want to ask you, like, if we can take away the concrete things, like your journey towards ACC, PCC, MCC. Like, if you have to say, like, what is the thing which you stopped doing, which you were doing after ACC, and then the things which you stopped doing after your PCC and after becoming an MCC?
So I think so. I because it's been quite a few years, and in between all of these things, I've also done a lot of other things. I've not just only walked the plain ACC, PCC, MCC path. But what I will, if I have to like really point out a few things, because ACC, when I trained for my ACC, and that was my first entry into coaching and being a coach, right? So I used to very diligently follow that structure, the ICF call structure. I remember our training institute had given us that structure. So you start with, what would you like to get from the session? How would you know, why is it important? How would you know it, what would be, so I would actually follow that script very well. It was useful to the client. It did get outcomes, but I think at an ACC level, now when I look back, I realized that a lot of the conversation was very transactional. Right? So the client will come and say, oh, I want to make a plan for my new next meeting, strategy meeting that is happening. So I would ask all those questions, right? And they would say, oh, the reason behind it is because I want to present well. And then we would actually get into making that very structured plan, right? And in all honesty, if I were to do that now, it would work very differently. And that's, I think I'm realizing as I'm speaking, and that's a lovely question. Thank you for asking that, Vinny, because it's also making me reflect. So I think what shifted for me was when I did my PCC training, the one that I did it for PCC, in that training, one of the things that they emphasized on was working with emotions. And of course, they had this very beautiful way of explaining, you can work with emotions as a coach, but you're not a therapist, right? And that's where I started doing work, which was more body, right? So if I'm feeling, like I remember working with a client and I started feeling a heaviness in my chest and I called it out. And the person said, yeah, I'm feeling like completely congested as I'm speaking to you, right? So I started working with those emotions, noticing emotions, calling out emotions, noticing the impact of those emotions on my own body. So that was the shift that happened for me when I started working with PCC. right? I started noticing the finer things about the client's body language. Another thing that happened around that same time was because I did my NLP master practitioner and then I did an NLP coach training also. So I started picking up a lot about the client's body language, their change of tone, their expressions, energy, so I started doing a lot of work with that. So my PCC shift was probably around that. And NLP taught me at that point to like really, really read a person, understand if they've used a certain word, so developed. So I always say this, right? Because I come from a technology background. So, when you're working with a machine, and something's not working, A plus B can only be C, D, and E. There are only so many options, right? It's very logical, right? It doesn't work like that with human beings, right? So I think the shift that happened for me around the PCC time was I started noticing those things in the client. I started picking up those things. Okay, again, another thing between ACC and PCC, both, I did use a lot of tools, techniques. I would always start with wheel of life, this, that, all of that. I used a lot of NLP techniques. I sometimes still do use NLP techniques, but I use it more from reading the client rather than, and sometimes I use visualization in my sessions. My journey to now, in between my PCC and MCC, I also got into team coaching. And so my view of the world became more systemic. So I introduced the systemic aspect into my coaching. So that was another shift, but that was still at PCC level. MCC, I think, became a deep partnership with the client, right? So when I say deep partnership, I started I started trusting my intuition more. Right? Like in PCC, I would read the client's face and say, okay, I saw a shift in your expression, or I felt you were thinking something. What was that about? Right? But in MCC, I think I started trusting that, okay, if my intuition is saying something, even if I've seen nothing change on the client's face, I will bring it out. The second thing, like I said earlier, was now I don't use tools, I don't use techniques. My coaching is purely conversational. It's more about depth. If the client says, I want to make an action plan, I generally find that the conversation ends up. So I don't take things at face value anymore. So presenting a situation is not necessarily what we end up coaching on. And also, I think when I use this word, that for me now coaching is more partnership, which means that I acknowledge that bringing my entire intuitive sense into it is adding value. Earlier, I would work only off what feels right for whatever the client's words are and their body languages. Now I also bring what's it triggering within me, and is this my experience or is this something that's coming from the client? Because one of the things I've now learned is that we pick up a lot of words and stuff which the client may not have said, but they may have thought it. So I've said, I think as human beings, we are way more powerful than we access it most times. So I think I've started picking up those things, but yeah. And I think I've become less dependent on my knowledge now. So yeah, so that's, I think those are the shifts, but lovely question. Thank you, Vineet, for asking this.
Thank you, Rachel, for beautifully framed it and for all those differentiators amongst your journey, ACC, PCC, MCC. Just the last one. I remember you mentioned that you have sharpened your intuitions. Uh, how can one sharpen their intuitions? Is it like being 100% present in the session? That's how you pick on everything, and that's how your intuitions are sharpened and heightened, go to the next level?
No, again, lovely question, Vineet, because I always say this, that intuition is my learned skill. Like I was telling earlier, I'm very logical by nature. My early profession was also very, very logical. I loved working with machines, and so I never needed to really rely too much on intuition. But one of my learnings is that we're all born with intuition, right? And I think the first reset to my intuition happened when I became a mother, because babies don't respond with words, right? They don't talk with words, but when you are holding a baby, the baby communicates very, very clearly. And anybody and everybody who's a parent here will know that they are able to communicate. They're able to let you know they're angry. They're able to let you know that they're hungry. And, so we are all born with intuition. if you've not experienced having babies, then you should talk about, dogs. Dogs are that dogs communicate without words as well, right? So I think that's our primary form of communication, right? It's always exists, right? One of the things that I had done was, because I had become this person who used to rely so heavily on knowledge, and I still like gaining knowledge. I still love learning, but because I used to be I learn this, I'll figure this out after I read so many things about it. I had stopped trusting the intuition part of it. We all have it. So it's about, so I think for me, what practices have helped is journaling, meditation, big one, being with myself, silence. And when you really, and before a session, I always meditate for at least 2 to 3 minutes, because I've found that when my mind is silent, the intuition does speak louder. So it's there. We just have to a little bit more consciously start paying attention to it.
Perfect.
I
Thank you so
tell you
much.
this, Vineet, early days of my coaching, people used to say intuition, and I'm like, how can you rely on intuition? Where's the logic behind it? Where's the data behind it? But now I completely believe that intuition is one of your biggest powers as a coach.
Love your answer, Rachel. Thank you so much. And congratulations once again for your MCC.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vineet, for those lovely 2 questions.
Thank-
We're out of time, but I just want to read Sunita's spoken about her being a work in progress as far as perfection is concerned. And she also says it's a lovely conversation, and she's thanking you, Rachel. And Ramana, I saw a lot of emojis throughout the conversation. So thank you for that. And he's also said that there's lots of aha moments in the session. And yeah, Preeti is saying, beautiful conversation, Rachel. We'll take one last question. Yeah, okay. Who's it going to be? And we'll close the session in 3 minutes exactly. One last question. Anybody with a last question? We probably have to do like a part 2 of this, Rachel, where they just, having an active dialogue with you, and probably you could coach somebody and show us what it means to be masterful.
Absolutely. Would love to do that. Yeah.
Yes, for sure. Okay, yeah, Sunit says she doesn't need any more tools, only got to focus on going deeper. Lovely, Sunit. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so we're getting a lot of thank yous. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. It was delightful. And Rachel, of course, with her wisdom, one of the early coaches that India has produced, and she continues to inspire us. I'm part of her team coaching cohort. I'm her student there. She's a lovely instructor. And yeah, so thank you very much. Thank you, Rachel, for your time and your wisdom. And I think it was such a invigorating session, and where you shared so authentically your life's experience, and you were so yourself. And I think that's what we look for when we do a coach's journey.
Thank you so much, Madhu, and thank you for curating such a beautiful discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody,
Pleasure's all mine.
for being here.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Good night. And I'll see you all the last Friday of April with another coach and their journey. Thank you.